it's good to have Dave Hutchings with me today, who is, I believe, what is your qualification, Dave? You're a physics teacher in school, but I assume you are scientifically trained.
Yes. Yeah. I better keep that up. Yeah. I'm a physicist. I did a physics degree back in starting in 2000, finishing in 2003 at York University, and then I did a PGCE where I specialised in physics, learning to teach physics to GCSE and A-level students.
Brilliant. So, Dave, I know you've written on this kind of subject, Christianity and science, and we have to be clear you're coming from a Christian world viewpoint. But let me give you 4 or 5 questions that I think some of our pupils have in their heads. The first is just straight there. Is it true that science is based on facts, historical, rational facts, whereas Christianity can come across as if it's just historical, emotional, wishy-washy, personal values of how to live? How do you put those two together?
Well, I think it's half true. It's true that science has lots of facts and it's very fact heavy, and we use our brains to do science, and we rationalize and we use reason. And I think it's also true that Christianity is tied up with the emotions and experience, but it's half the story. And the fact is that science is also tied up with the emotions, and Christianity is also reasonable. So both Christianity and science have both of those elements to them. I'll give you some examples. Science, some of the most important discoveries in the whole history of science were not made by somebody doing an experiment and sitting down, sort of detached, emotionally detached, and looking at the data and calculating something. Some of the biggest leaps forward came by people having a kind of gut instinct or an emotional response to something, or a hunch. It's amazing how often it happens. And quite often those hunches are completely unjustified by any kind of scientific background. Kekulé, who came up with some of the most important rules in all of chemistry to come up with chemical bonding, it happened to him in a dream as he fell asleep by a fire. Einstein, who came up with some of the most important ideas in the history of physics, he came up with some of those ideas during sort of transcendental visions that he had. That were nothing to do with the lab and nothing to do with any calculations. He just imagined what it would be like to ride along by a light beam. And not only that, that doing science is an emotional process. So here are a couple of quotes. One from Ramachandran, who's one of the greatest neuroscientists at work, says, his quote from him, "The minute you succumb to outside pressure, you cease to become creative. Science is like a love affair with nature. It's an elusive, tantalizing mistress. It has all the turbulence and twists and turns of romantic love, but that's part of the game." And Stephen Hawking, who probably a lot of the students have heard of, he says, science is not only a disciple of reason, but also one of romance and passion. And then the flip side of that is, if you look through the history of Christianity, Christianity could almost be described as being sort of obsessed with reason and rationality at many points through its history. So you have Peter Abelard, who wrote this very influential book called Yes or No, and it had a whole load of questions, hundreds of questions, where the people who wanted to be priests had to answer yes or no and then support their answer. And there would be questions like, does God already know what we're going to do? Could God have made more than one universe? And rather than it being wishy-washy, this was expected to be a display of logic and reasoning and prowess. You have people like Thomas Bayes, whose statistical analysis of probability is still used by scientists all over the world. When he first came up with it, the first thing he did with it was use it to write down a mathematical proof of God's goodness. So you get both. You get emotion and passion and reason and logic in science and in Christianity.
Okay, yeah, I hear that. That's quite convincing. I guess I would then ask the question, 2021, science is modern, it's progressive. We're looking to science to get us out of holes all the time. Whereas if you mention Christianity, people go, oh, old churches, a dead story, history.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's two ways of looking at that. If Christianity was constantly changing its core message, then people would say, well, you don't know what the truth is then, do you? You know, the church used to say that Jesus was the Son of God, but now they're saying something else. Actually, the fact that Christianity has been pretty consistent about its main message over 2,000 years is not weakness, it's strength. It shows that it's much more likely to be true if generations of people across all kind of different time zones and cultures, and experiences and languages and races have said the same thing about Jesus. That makes it more likely to be true, not less likely to be true. And then I think the other thing that we can say is that Christianity is progressive in the sense that it has been at the forefront of a lot of the biggest changes that have ever benefited humanity. It's at the forefront of medicine and then treatment for people. It's been at the forefront of childcare and looking after the widow and the orphan, of social benefits, of overcoming racism, of overcoming slavery. So all these things, Christianity has been the driving force. And even now, Matthew Paris, who's a journalist, he says, when there's a disaster and I turn up to report on it, doesn't matter where it is in the world or what's going on, the Christians have always got there first. They're the people who are there caring for people before I arrive. So I think Christianity is up to date and beating hard in that what it does is it constantly pushes us to be better, to do better things. And science, sure, science makes progress, but let's face it, one of the reasons that science makes progress is that it's often wrong. And a new theory has to come along to replace an old theory. You know, it would be a better post for science if it said science has never had to make any progress because it got everything right straight away. We haven't had to go anywhere. We haven't had to change any theories. And of course, sometimes it does get stuck. It gets stuck because a very influential person makes a claim and people bow to that person's authority instead of moving on. And sometimes those people are able to shut down the publishing of people who've got different ideas. So I think it's too simplistic to say Christianity just stays still and science progresses.
Do you think it's interesting during lockdown? Nearly every day we've had the government coming on 5 o'clock with two scientists next to them. Every day this has happened. And only once, it seems to me, over this last year has Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, actually come on television. Well, it was on BBC Morning, but gave 5 or 10 minutes about the whole issue of COVID-19. Do you think one of our difficulties actually today is that we're constantly looking for science to give us the answers, and the politicians are hesitant to say, but actually we need some ethical decisions here, and they're based on our belief system. And as a country, we're hesitant to acknowledge that.
No, I think there's a little bit of embarrassment from some people in leadership who think, well, isn't all this God stuff just fairy tales? Or am I going to get a bit embarrassed if I say, we're going to trust in God for this? The danger is to make it an either or. There's this big idea that floats around a lot where it says, well, either you're trusting God or you're trusting science. That doesn't match up with the historical story of Christianity at all. Even in the medieval period, which gets all the bad press, you would go to church and you would pray to get better for an illness, but you'd also go and ask the local healer or the local doctor what they could do about it. And that's true of modern Christians today. In my church, for example, if someone's poorly, we pray for them and we pray with them for God to make them better. But we also would expect them to be seeking medical advice and medical care. And we believe that, and the church has always taught, that God gives people different gifts to use for the benefit of humanity. And that science is another one of those gifts. And like I said, medical care, proper medical care for people those sorts of things, were first really driven and funded in the mainstream by Christianity. Dissection was legalized by the Christian church. Anesthesia was championed by it. Inoculation and vaccination was championed by it. So there's this strong history of saying, let's do both. And I think the other thing that we can say is there have been lots of people all over the world praying during this pandemic. And so if we're seeing these advances, we can praise science for it, but also we can say, well, thank you, God, for answering the prayers of an awful lot of people who've been asking for some sort of relief from this. And finally, why does it even matter in the first place? Why do we care whether people live or die? Why do we care about suffering? You know, if we are just a bunch of protons, neutrons, and electrons, who cares what happens to us? Protons don't have any feelings or emotions, they don't have any intrinsic value. What is it that makes a human being special? Why don't we want a human being to suffer? Why do we think suffering is wrong? And I would say that those ideas are very naturally grounded in Christianity. That every human being is a creation of God. I have brothers and sisters all over the world, made by my Father in heaven, and they have value because they're his, and he made them. They're his idea. And suffering, we have this feeling that suffering is wrong, and God says, one day, I'm going to bring all suffering to an end. So do you want to be with me when that happens? And so by saying, yes, I really would like to, and I really would like to come back to you, my God, and I'm looking forward to that time, that's stepping into Christianity and saying, I agree that suffering is wrong. There is something wrong about suffering. I don't want to be part of that anymore.
Yes, I hear that. I mean, I think it's interesting that we never hear people say, oh, the trouble with the world is we're overpopulated, so we should have a big cull of humans, actually. Reduce the numbers down. It would make life a lot better for the planet. And we don't say that because actually, fundamentally, we have a deep Christian belief that human beings are made in God's image and they're special, and therefore every individual is special. But let me take you on to the thought that, yes, I recognize many historical scientists who were clergy, religious people. But I wonder whether they saw God as, a clockmaker. They made the universe, they made the clock, and God wound it up. And then he sits back. And they were the scientists, religious people looking at how the clock worked, which is wonderful. But where does modern day, where does miracles fit into this? Where does God's action today fit into this?
Okay, well, I think there's two things to say there. One is, if you want to know what these people were thinking, you can read what they wrote. We have it, it's available. And they don't say, oh, I'm studying some distant God who doesn't care about me anymore. They don't say, I'm studying some big machine, and yes, I believe there's some creator, but I can't know that creator. That creator's not interesting. They say, I'm studying this because I want to know God better, right? And they say that explicitly. Here's Johannes Kepler, who came up with the idea that the planets are not orbiting in circles, they're orbiting in slightly squashed circles called ellipses. And from that we get his planetary laws, and Isaac Newton then used those laws to formulate gravity. Kepler says, for the theatre of the world, he sees the world as a big theatre where God is putting on a play. The theatre of the world is so ordered that there exist within it suitable signs by which human minds, likenesses of God, he's saying his mind is like a mini version of God's mind, are not only invited to study the divine works, he believes God has invited him to do this as a gift, from which they may evaluate the founder's goodness, he can learn something about God from it, but also are assisted in acquiring more deeply. So Kepler's saying, God's made this world, he's given me a brain to study it, he's invited me to study it, and when I study it, he helps me. And by that, I get to know more about his goodness and his kindness. It makes me fall more in love with him. And you see this sort of stuff again and again and again from these scientists. And it matches what Paul says in the book of Romans in the Bible, where he says, what can be known about God can be found by studying what God has made. And so it's this desire to get to know God better. And then the second thing you asked about, this idea of miracles, you say, well, what about Jesus walking on water? Or what about the sun stopping in the sky? All these things we read about in the Bible. That's completely unscientific. You can't possibly believe that and follow miracles and be a scientist. Well, let me turn that on its head. I think it's actually impossible to believe in miracles if you don't have a scientific worldview. You see, the whole point of a miracle is that it's the breaking of a law. In other words, it's what doesn't usually happen. That's the entire point of a miracle. If you don't think that there are any laws of nature, then there's no such thing as a miracle, because anything can happen anytime, right? And so there isn't anything special about an event like Jesus walking on the water, because you'd say, well, there are no rules about walking on water, so anybody could do anything at any time. Whereas if you believe that walking on water is scientifically impossible because that's what the rules of science tell us, then suddenly Jesus walking on water becomes something very different and very strange. And maybe it's there to tell us something that Jesus might be very, very different. There might be something very strange about Jesus. And so in order to believe in a miracle, you've got to believe it's an exception to the law. And if you don't believe in laws, you can't have any miracles.
Yeah, I hear that. And I can't think of the philosophers, but didn't someone say all scientific laws are incomplete because, in fact, we haven't got complete knowledge yet? Therefore, there's always a depth of mystery that science is pushing on into, which is creating laws constantly changing, of course.
Yeah, as scientists, we should always hold things loosely. What we should be saying is, this is what we think is right now. It may be that we make some new discovery that comes on and makes us change our ideas. But science is based on this fundamental idea, actually, that we can understand the universe. There'd be no point in trying to be a scientist if you couldn't understand the universe. But then you've got to have a pretty good reason for thinking why you should be able to understand the universe. I mean, what on earth? There's like, a couple of pounds of meat in my head. Why should that be able to understand the universe? Why should I be able to look out and figure out what's going on? If I believe, like Kepler did, that my mind is a mini version of God's mind, and that I'm looking at a world that God has made, then the whole thing makes sense. Of course I can understand the world. But if there's no God, there's no reason to think that I should be able to understand the world at all, or to think that I'm ever right about anything.
Yes. David, you've got us thinking, which is what this short series is about. And I know you've written about this, which might help our pupils. So now is your little moment to give a plug.
A chance to plug my book. Okay, so there's a couple of books that people might be interested in. Here's one. This is called Let There Be Science. Now, I wrote this with a professor called Tom McLeish, who's a fellow of the Royal Society and one of the top scientists in the world. People might, that's got a lot of science stories. This is a kind of story book, really, about the history of science and what it's got to do with religion, and can science and religion be friends? So people might like that one. And then there's also this one. Now, this is significantly more nerdy, as you can probably tell from the title, God, Stephen Hawking and the Multiverse. So if you've ever wondered, well, what did Stephen Hawking actually do and what did he say? And he talked a lot about God as well, and black holes and other universes. Then this is an explanation of Stephen Hawking's work, but for the kind of non-scientist. It helps you, it guides you through it, but there's no equations in the whole book, which some people might like. You can see here that Dr. Althea Wilkinson, who's an astronomer at Jodrell Bank, she says, if you wanted to understand Stephen Hawking, but you couldn't face the maths, this is the book for you. So people might want to pick those up, especially in lockdown when we all need something to occupy our minds. Don't we?
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. And we know that our pupils, if they want to chat to you about this in any way, they can always email you. So thank you very much, David. We wish you well.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Bless you.
Bye.